So the guitar's design makes more sense when each finger commits to be in charge of a corresponding fret. They will be able to independently navigate vertically to and from any string on their corresponding frets. The lateral outward movement of the MCP joints, called abduction, is produced by the contraction of the dorsal interosseous muscles. These muscles interact with each other in extremely sophisticated ways that even baffle scientists. A string can take infinite shapes, but if we tie the ends and stretch it well, it becomes a perfectly straight one-dimensional line in space that will gradually gather elastic energy if we push it. The more we move an elastic object away from its equilibrium position, the more elastic energy it will accumulate. On a guitar, a string is trapped between two knots, and its musical existence begins when we start turning the tuning pegs, adding tension to it. Just like a pendulum always takes the same amount of time to go through each swing period, a 10th string will produce the same number of oscillations per second, creating a sound wave with a constant frequency, which is an essential attribute of a musical tone. The string's energy will be transmitted into the guitar's body through two additional still points, one at the saddle piece at the bridge, and another at the nut piece between the neck and the headstock of the guitar. The saddle and the nut's elevation deviate the string from its fundamental equilibrium position, creating pressure points where they intersected. The size of the angle that the string has at these contact points reflects the level of energy transmission from the string's vibration to the guitar's body. Only the portion of the string between the nut and the saddle will vibrate when plucked. The string's gauge, its tension, as well as its length, are three variables that determine the frequency at which the string will oscillate when plucked, and will determine the note that it produces. For example, the 6th string is designed to be tense to the level at which it oscillates 82.4 times per second, which is the frequency that defines the note that we call E, or Mi. We can change the string's pitch by changing its length, since someone had an excellent idea of installing a fret on the fretboard that sits very close to the suspended string. If we press down strongly enough on the string with, for example, our first finger, we will create a new still point at its intersection with the fret. To direct its weight efficiently, the finger will need to push the string against the normal force of the fretboard, which is perpendicular to it. We will then have shortened the string's length, and when we plug it, it will vibrate faster, producing the pitch of the next note of the tempered scale, which is the family of notes that all instruments use and that are a semitone away from each other. The closer our finger is to the fret, the narrower the string's angle is, and therefore the more steady our still point becomes. When this angle is too wide, it will not produce enough pressure against the fret, and the string won't remain completely still when vibrating, but will bounce against the fret, producing a buzzing sound. So ideally, the finger should be very close to the fret, but not on the vibrating portion of the string, or it will otherwise dampen it. So we can now play E or F, and if we add another fret at a specific distance, finger 2 can now shorten the string to an F sharp, and another fret for finger 3 can shorten the string to a G, and we can play G sharp with another for finger 4, and we can play A. Oh, we don't have another finger for A. We ran out of fingers, so we'll have to leave this so-called first position and shift the whole hand to another position, like the 5th position, by moving the whole hand add more frets in order to play not only A, but A sharp, B, and C. Or we could conveniently stay on our first position and install a neighbor string with a thinner diameter that produces the note A when plucked open. We can then also play A sharp, B, C, C sharp, and then add another string below for D and keep going up the tempered scale without having to change positions. We can keep adding more strings, but 6 strings seem to be a good number and thus has become a standard. Although conventions have their own crises here and there too. So the guitar's design makes more sense when each finger commits to be in charge of a corresponding fret. In turn, the thumb can be in permanent contact with the back of the guitar's neck, producing a clamping action that will strengthen the fingers. The permanent contact of the thumb and its gripping action also locks the position of the arm, which secures the stability of the hand. The arm can help a finger to move up and down the strings, but playing the guitar polyphonically, like we do when we play the classical guitar, implies that the fingers will play high and low notes simultaneously, switching back and forth between them, and therefore constantly moving in opposite directions. The fingers need to be able to move downwards towards the higher sounding strings at the same time that other fingers move upwards towards the lower sounding ones, so the arm and the hand can only remain neutral by staying still in one position for the most part. Each finger will need to rely on its 2 mobile joints, which are the metacarpophalangeal joint, aka MCP, and its proximal interphalangeal joint, aka PIP, to move up and down by carefully maneuvering their flexion and extension. Unlike its 2 parent joints, the distal interphalangeal joint, aka DIP joint, will always involuntarily mirror the flexion or extension of the DIP. Since the MCP is the parent joint of the finger, it can move the entire digit towards and away from the strings. Its circular trajectory normally has a range of around 130 degrees, and the strength of its flexion will have a stronger pushing force over a flat plane, such as the fretboard, when these meet as close to a perpendicular angle as possible. Hence, the knuckles joint ideal location is over the virtual extension of the fretboard's plane, which unfortunately we can't see or touch, but only estimate from our playing position. The virtual line between the MCP joint and the fingertip is the radius of its trajectory, and its length is determined by the angle of the PIP joint. Each string is at a different distance from the MCP joint, so each will require a specific angle of the PIP joint to be in the trajectory of the fingertip and be pressed by it. By controlling the size of this angle, after the MCP removes the finger from the string, the PIP can aim the fingertip at different strings and land on them when the knuckle joint flexes again. Just like a cannon aims at different targets by changing its angle, the PIP will aim at the chosen string before the knuckle triggers the pushing force. As we said, the distal interphalangeal joint, aka DIP joint, will involuntarily mirror the flexion or extension of the PIP joint. This mirroring accelerates the rotation of the distal phalanx, respective to the fretboard, making the point of the fingertip that is perpendicular to the string to rapidly move and change as the finger climbs up or down. Although we can voluntarily cancel this mirror flexion, this requires an additional effort that is not necessary if we allow the distal phalanx to meet the fretboard at different angles. The flexion of each MCP joint is controlled mainly by its lumbrical muscle, which interestingly does not attach to any bone, and which tendon connects with the extensor tendon, producing an involuntary extension of the PIP when contracting. The PIP joint flexion is mainly controlled by the flexor digitorum superficialis muscle in the forearm, whose tendon inserts in the intermediate phalanx bone, and the DIP's joint's flexion is controlled mainly by the flexor digitorum profundus that inserts in the distal phalanx bone. The extension of the DIP, and with it that of the entire finger, is controlled by a single extensor muscle. Through their different levels of contractions and relaxations, these muscles interact with each other in extremely sophisticated ways that even baffle scientists, by combining their forces to produce the most subtle and refined movements of the fingers. When a fingertip presses against a flat surface, the size of the contact area will vary significantly depending on the angle at which the distal phalanx meets the plane. When trying to press a string, the optimal position of the distal phalanx is perpendicular to the fretboard. By being parallel to the fretboard's normal force, the finger directs its energy more efficiently, achieving a stronger grip of the string against the fret. The farther our distal phalanx is from a perpendicular angle with the fretboard, the closer it is to making contact with the neighbor string too. This will not be a problem unless this portion of the neighbor string needs to also vibrate as part of an overlapping node that we don't want to block. Since the finger is a bit wider on the side of the pad than on the nail side, the finger pad will make contact with the neighbor string and block it if the tilt of the distal phalanx towards it is around 30 degrees or more from the perpendicular, while a tilt towards the nail will have a wider range of around 40 degrees from the perpendicular, before making contact with a neighbor string and blocking it. Of course, this range increases slightly if either of the neighbor strings is being pressed by another finger, in which case it will be moved closer to the fretboard and a bit farther from the blocking finger. From the perpendicular, the finger will need to rotate about 20 degrees more to reach and press the upper neighbor string, and therefore will still be able to avoid any contact with the lower neighbor string. But as it rotates away from the perpendicular to climb up to upper floors, it will be more difficult and then impossible to avoid making contact with the lower neighbor of the string that it's trying to press. If all the fingertips had to simultaneously land perpendicularly on a flat surface, such as a fretboard, they would land on different strings corresponding to each finger's length. Finger 2 can potentially block finger 1 if it's trying to hold a ringing note on the bottom neighbor string. But fortunately, since finger 2 is longer, it will conveniently arrive at the upper neighbor string at almost the same angle as finger 1, despite both being on different strings. The angle between both phalanges and the fretboard will depend on the vertical position of the hand in space, but it will be a very similar one on both distal phalanges. Finger 3, which can potentially block fingers 1 and or 2, if any of these need to hold a note on the bottom neighbor string, cannot be as polite with its neighbors. Finger 3 would require these fingers to lean more towards the nail if they need to play on the bottom neighbor strings and do not want to be blocked. Since finger 2 is the tallest, it will need to lean more towards the nail than finger 1. Finger 4 is the real troublemaker of the team. Not only can it potentially block fingers 1, 2, and 3 if they need to simultaneously play on the lower neighbor string, but since he's the shortest, it will require them to lean even more towards the nail whenever they dare to play below it. As we said, the PIP joint's main role is to produce and maintain the angle that corresponds to the target string, and it will need to do so even without any visual or tactile reference, but based on the estimation of its muscle memory, to which the stability of the hand significantly contributes. Once the fingertip makes contact with its target string, the PIP and DIP joints must maintain their angles, despite the increasing workload, by performing an isometric contraction. When leaning towards the finger pad, the flexor digitorium profundus and flexor digitorium superficialis, which are in charge of the flexion of the DIP and MCP joints, will be in charge of gradually contracting as the weight of the string increases at the average rate of approximately 100 grams per millimeter displacement, in order to maintain their angles and allow the flexor lumbrical muscles of the MCP joint push the string towards the fretboard. When leaning towards the nail, though, since the perpendicular normal force of the fretboard will push the fingertip in the opposite direction, the extensor muscles will take over and perform the isometric contraction needed for the DIP and PIP joints to maintain their angles, while the lumbricals flex the MCP. There is a natural tendency to prefer the tilt towards the pad, which requires the simultaneous contraction of the three flexor systems. The DIP flexor muscle is stronger and better equipped than the single extensor that inserts in the distal phalanx, and there is more free skin surface towards the pad. Tilting towards the nail requires the DIP extensor and the MCP flexor to work together, even though they contract in opposite directions. This is why, for example, you don't see someone trying to play the piano with the tips tilted towards the nail. You might find your fingers resisting to tilt towards the nail, which, if it's not cut very short, can be a serious obstacle. The nail needs to be as short as possible to clear as much skin surface for the string to be pressed against and to increase the range of possible angles. Once the fingers learn to seamlessly transition from a pad tilt to a nail tilt and from their corresponding flexor to extensor systems, they will be able to independently navigate vertically to and from any string on their corresponding frets, making contact with the area of the tip that faces the string at any given angle. Nevertheless, the horizontal area that the four frets on the first position enclose is much wider than what the extended or flexed fingers can cover. Lined up next to each other, our fingers barely cover the space of the first 3 or 2 frets. The extension and flexion of our fingers alone will not be enough to have each finger stay on track on their corresponding frets. The DIP and PIP joints are simple hinge joints that can only move in one axis. But fortunately, the MCP joints are ellipsoid joints, which have the ability not only to flex and extend, but also to abduct. Besides the MCPs, we only have 2 more types of ellipsoid joints in our body. One type in our toe knuckles, and the other in our wrists. The MCP joint and the wrist have the same functional design and envelope of motion. Wrist and MCPs can flex, extend, abduct, adduct, and circumduct. The lateral outward movement of the MCP joints, called abduction, is produced by the contraction of the dorsal interosseous muscles that insert on the lateral side of the base of the proximal phalanx for fingers 1, 2, and 3, and by the abductor digiti minimi that abducts the little finger. A straight line between the tips of the first and fourth fingers of the splayed hand will cross through 2 and 3 and closer to a perpendicular angle with finger 3. Both 2 and 3 will therefore need to flex down for all the fingertips to arrive to their corresponding frets on a single string. If the adducted fingers are brought by the arm to a position where finger 3 is placed over its corresponding fret, it will be easier for the other fingers to get to their corresponding frets on their own by abducting. If instead the arm brings the hand with adducted fingers to a position where finger 2 is on its corresponding fret, it will be more difficult for the other fingers to arrive to their corresponding frets by abducting. It will be even more difficult for the fingers if the arm brings finger 1 to its corresponding fret, or finger 4. Just like I consider the index as the center of the right hand, finger 3 can be therefore established as the relative center of a position. To do so, the arm needs to adopt a position in which finger 3 is placed parallel to its corresponding fret. This means that the entire finger, from its tip to its knuckle, should be positioned parallel to the third fret of the position. The forearm's relaxed position is one where the palm of the hand is in a vertical position and facing towards the right. But since we don't hold the guitar vertically like a cello, the left forearm needs to rotate counterclockwise and away from this relaxed position. The bicep and the supinator muscles are in charge of this forearm rotation, called supination. And besides the extension of the shoulder and the elbow flexion, these will need to be kept contracted to maintain the palm parallel to the guitar's neck and finger 3 parallel to its fret. The more horizontal the guitar is held, the higher the level of this contraction will need to be. So a 45 degrees tilt doesn't only balance the guitar, but is a perfect compromise between the right and left hand ideal postures. As the splayed fingers flex further downwards towards the first string, the natural oblique trajectory of their flexion will make the tips come closer together. So the abduction of the MCP joints will need to gradually increase to keep the fingers on track. This synchronization between the abductor, flexor, and extensor muscles to keep the fingers on the path of their corresponding frets is probably the most challenging aspect of the left hand technique, as it requires a high level of coordination between all these systems, as well as flexibility on the ligaments, which are the connective tissue that keeps the bones attached to each other. However, the MCP joint is a very different kind of joint when it is extended than when it is flexed. At a full extension, the synovial spaces between the bones are large, the contact surface of the bones is small, its collateral ligament is loose, and the tendon of the interosseous muscle is straight and enabled. At its full extension, the MCP joint is a very loose, free-moving joint. At its full flexion, the contact surface of the bones is total. The synovial space becomes very small. The collateral ligament gets tightened since it has to belch out over the condyle or bone protuberance that appears in between its insertions, and the interosseous muscle tendon is bent and disabled. The fully flexed MCP has no rotation and no lateral freedom, but it's a very stable joint. Having the MCP closer to their fully extended position is an essential condition for the fingers to be able to abduct and freely navigate through their corresponding frets in every position. Interestingly, the flexion and extension of the MCP joints are involuntarily and inversely mirrored by the flexion and extension of the wrist. Flexing the wrist exerts tension on the extensor mechanism, so the MCPs will extend to compensate. In its relaxed position, though, the hand likes to sit close to the end of its range of extension. And due to this and the hand's weight, there is a strong tendency to allow the hand to fall back when reaching for the fretboard. Allowing the wrist to relax doesn't only immediately disable the finger's ability to abduct, but also moves the thumb away from its opposite position, replacing it with the palm that has nowhere near the mobility and independence of the thumb. Each finger is responsible for its corresponding home fret, but the fingertip should only press on one single string at a time. If more than one string needs to be pressed on the same fret, the host finger can ask a neighbor finger for help by inviting him over as a temporary guest to press on another string. When the fingers spread out, the index and pinky can move farther away from the ring and middle from their straight position. The index and pinky are able to move back to where the splayed middle and ring fingers are, but neither the middle nor ring can reach their outer neighbors unless an external force is applied. Due to their superior range of abduction, the pinky and index are able to independently move to the middle and ring fingers' frets, providing help either above or below them, without changing the hand position, or can even stretch outside of the position by at least one fret. Taking advantage of its longer size, the middle finger can manage to provide some help too, but by making a much stronger effort and with some limitations. Being a friendly neighborhood to overcome some of these limitations when possible, a host finger can ask the arm to provide the transportation of the guest fingers. The host can become a still point on its note, which will guide the arm through a clockwise rotation. This still point will be the center of the rotation that will make the fingers orbit around it. A counterclockwise rotation is also possible, but clockwise is more natural. We can hold a glass like this, but we very much prefer to do so this way. So when a finger needs help, the arm can make the entire hand rotate away from its parallel position and towards an oblique position. This will move the fingers away from their home frets, and their flexion and or extension will then allow them to complete the commute to their host finger's fret. Since they are moved away from their home frets, the fingers that are farther from their host will have a harder time accessing their own home frets if they need to. A good moral principle is to avoid asking for help with something that you can do on your own. So it is implied that the host finger is already busy pressing on a string before asking a neighbor to come over to his fret for help. It is always preferable to have the host finger pressing on a note and establishing this as the center first, before the rotation towards an oblique position is initiated. clear and established center will guide the arm and wrist on the rotation. The rotation towards the oblique position might need to take place while the note of the host finger is ringing, so the arm movement has to be careful and precise enough to not disturb the stability of the contact point and allow the finger to maintain its pressure on the string through the process. The adjacent neighbor should volunteer first as a guest finger, and since all but the host finger are moved away from their corresponding frets, an oblique position will be inconvenient for any finger that still needs to play on its corresponding fret. Such a finger will need to abduct even more to stay home and might not be able to reach all of the strings. Finger 4 has the advantage of having some level of mobility on its metacarpal bone, and its relaxed position is next to finger 3, so he is always glad and willing to help finger 3 on any additional notes. On the other hand, since finger 3 is considered the center of our position, both of its neighbors will seem to be too far away to move to on its own. We should rather avoid asking the 3 to be a guest on a parallel position, unless we have time to shift positions, drop him off, and shift back. Since finger 2 is taller than its neighbors, it can manage to arrive to a neighbor fret by abducting and extending towards the bass strings. Because our gifted finger 1 can't block any of the other fingers, it has the option of pressing multiple strings simultaneously, instead of asking the neighbors for help. To do so, we can relax the DIP joint and allow the distal phalanx to make contact with the pad by allowing the flexion of the PIP to tilt the phalanx as we press. The pad of the distal phalanx can press up to 3 strings, or at least 2 for smaller fingers on full-sized instruments, without compromising the mobility of the MCP and PIP joints, making it a very flexible bar that the finger can independently move up and down the fret and can even allow the finger to stretch or remain on its fret while rotating to an oblique position, or even be the guest of finger 2. To press more than 3 strings, we will need to include the intermediate phalanx on our bar. The PIP will flex until it is parallel to the fret. Since the MCP joint always remains abducted, the finger will make contact in between the lateral and palmar surfaces and will therefore require both the abductor and flexor muscles to work together. A common mistake is to rely only on the flexor muscle, which, although is stronger, will flex the MCP, disabling its ability to abduct when it needs to do so even more. To press all the 6 strings, we will need the upper portion of the proximal phalanx to also make contact with the string, but this shouldn't limit the ability of the MCP to abduct. Although any movement away from the relaxed position of a finger requires it to stretch, we will use the term stretching to refer to the action of either fingers 1 or 4 when playing outside of the position. Because of the additional effort required, we should try to avoid stretching when choosing our fingerings. Nevertheless, we will always encounter musical passages where stretching is necessary, So, although we should always try to avoid it, we must always be ready to stretch by including stretching exercises in our practice. When we abduct a finger, there are two opposite forces at play. On the one side, the abductor muscle contractions, and on the other, the ligaments, which are tissues that surround each joint and that are in charge of holding the bones together. This is why an effective practice routine should aim at increasing both the muscle power and the elasticity of the ligaments, which take more time to be rebuilt. When the music requires notes that are outside of the range of the position, the arm will need to shift the hand to a new position. The safest way to perform a shift is to have the finger responsible for the first note in the new position make contact with the target string on its corresponding fret, minimize its weight, and then guide the arm to the new fret afterwards, while maintaining the contact with the string. The status of guest or host should be preferably established before the shift. Rather than trying to land on the fret and string coordinates of the fingerboard's grid simultaneously, it is much safer to find one coordinate first, that of the string, before moving towards the fret. If you need to arrive at a location defined by two coordinates in a grid, like 6th Avenue and 42nd Street, doing so simultaneously will be much more complicated and only possible if you land from the sky in a parachute. It will be infinitely much safer if we first find one coordinate, like the street, and then walk through it to find the avenue. Whenever we have two consecutive ascending notes on the same string and on the same position, the second note can be played by the left hand finger alone if it strikes the string at a higher speed, fast enough to press on the new note without interrupting the string's vibration. Besides giving the right hand a little break, the hammer-on will produce a smooth connection between the two notes and create a strong, weak articulation between them. When pressing on a ringing note, a left-hand finger can also pluck the string and produce a lower note by performing a pull-off afterwards. To do so, the PIP will flex to bend the string downwards, while the other finger firmly holds its still point, and then the MCP will extend to remove the block. The sudden release of the block in a pull-off can compromise the stability of the hand, though. So the two fingers involved in the pull-off must be on the string before the finger begins to bend the string. If the pull-off is to an open string, the finger playing the note after the open string should be sitting on its note whenever possible to contribute to the hand stability. Their inward and outward motions allows the hammer-on and the pull-off to happen in a cyclic sequence to play grace notes or trills. Dear friends, thank you for making it this far. I can't wait to share with you the episode on the right-hand principles, and then what I think you will find more useful, a series of videos on the application of these concepts to, number 1, develop your playing abilities, and number 2, understanding and solving the specific technical problems that we run into when learning music on the guitar. Your support is essential to make all this possible, so please do me a favor and subscribe to my channel, turn on the notification bell, or consider using the donation button in the video description. There you will also find information about online or in-person lessons, courses, and more free content as I make it available. Thank you again, leave your questions and comments, and I will see you in the next video.